struggle with the legal frames that we inherit, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Women's Convention, and then because the issues many of us work on now were never thought of when the governments were drafting in 1945, in 1948, in 1966. They never thought of half this stuff. Interpreting those treaties and then being authorized that that interpretation is right is a game. And advocates play the game with pushing things through to courts, finding courts, getting human rights organizations to stick their necks out a little farther than the court, and then coming back. It's a game.
But it's a game. In our class, remember, this game has been going on for a long time. So the anti-slavery thing, remember, the proponents, the art lawyers for Dred Scott argued based on an 18th century British decision for his case.
Right.
So this game has been.
That's the game of.
That's what lawyers do. That's one version.
It's also what when social movements come to law, they play this game, and it both empowers them and constrains them because you get caught in the law. You get caught with how far the law can go, and because human rights organizations like Amnesty, like Human Rights Watch, built up their credibility not just on documentation, but by saying you can believe us when we interpret the treaties. If they go too far and a government says your interpretation is not justified, they lose credibility, which to them hurts their entire cause.
And we're going to come back to this. I'm just trying to point out again, there's a deeper history of this tradition and even the international tradition that goes back. So now I think the next section, we're going to see this little clip,
right.
and I think you see the general point. Ali may want to introduce it, but what we're looking at is the particular political moment that these women's rights become re-internationalized. They've been internationalized before in different contexts, and how they become part of contemporary practice. And Ali thought this film would be a good way to see these stories. You want to say a little more about that?
The film was made about a tribunal that was held in 1993. So a tribunal in the popular sense, a people's tribunal. And you'll see the movie explains it. But this moment, 1993, is when, for the first time since 1968, governments got together to talk about human rights. So from 68 in Tehran, when they had their first World Conference on Human Rights, no human rights conferences until 1993. And those 3 decades of silence were all about the Cold War. Nobody trusted that if you got the governments together to talk about human rights, they would actually have any consensus that would be progressive. So there was silence at the world level. 93, post-Cold War, things are loosening, World Conference on Human Rights organized in Vienna. And this we're showing 12 minutes of a 50-minute documentary of what gets presented by these women's groups to bust open the UN to women's human rights. And I guess for me, I would like you to think about this movie in 2 ways. Both the thing itself, what does the movie show you and how did it work? But then take a step back and go, really, how did it work? What kinds of stories are being told to get women's rights into human rights?
Back to our story, the narratives that we had at the beginning of the course. A good example of not in print, or not in pictures, but in film, the kind of humanitarian narrative gets produced.
So this is all about, as you'll notice, there's the women and violence. Yeah? Okay. What the women's groups called for in the Vienna Tribunal was an international criminal court for women. What gets created, to your knowledge?
A repertoire.
Well, a repertoire. But there is now an international criminal court. But it is not that the global movement to set up an international criminal court, which happens in 2000 with the adoption of something called the Rome Statute, has its own trajectory in history. The notion of a criminal court that can try individuals, not governments, for gross violations of the laws of war or crimes against humanity or genocide. Okay? That move to set up an international criminal court basically gets re-energized around 1993, around the same time as this. And what happens is gender-specific concerns around genocide and crimes against humanity get integrated. So the definition of rape is expanded to include, interestingly, both men and women, and to remove all the limitations at the international level that national rape laws have. Like lots of national rape laws, if you're raped by your husband, not a rape. If the evidence that a woman gives includes the fact that she was sexually active outside of marriage, her evidence is put aside. So all those liabilities, when Tom was talking about liabilities that women suffered under, get removed in the definition of rape of the International Criminal Court, but it's not a criminal court specific to women. So gender, and I think many feminists think that the gender integration of the International Criminal Court was a successful gender integration into an independent criminal court, but not a separate one on women.
And this country has not signed this.
This country signed and then unsigned. Their unsigning is a whole other thing.
What exactly is a rapporteur?
What is a rapporteur? Good question. To answer that, a rapporteur is an expert within the UN system who writes reports. That doesn't tell you much, but let me give you 2 more sentences. In the UN system, and my class has heard me say this ad nauseum, governments talk to governments. Governments comment on governments. It takes and has taken 40 years for non-governmental experts to be given the power to write about governments. And these rapporteurs are given the power by vote of governments in this Human Rights Commission that you read about to write reports on specific human rights issues of concern to that commission. So the rapporteur on violence against women is an expert. Currently, it's a woman named Rashida Manjoo, who's a South African lawyer, who is empowered by the UN to go to different countries, collect information, and write a public report about specific governments' response to violence against women. And her expert report then is debated publicly at the UN. So it's a pressure point on national governments. So these experts provide an incredible end to the UN system to be independent. They're not supposed to take money, take guidance, have political bias about which countries they pick, and to write publicly about human rights concerns in countries. She focuses on violence against women. There's about 30 of these rapporteurs.
Refugees.
There's refugees, there's extreme poverty, there's arbitrary disappearance, arbitrary execution. There's 30 of them.
There's also an undersecretary now for the status of women, right? That Michelle Bachelet
Well,
fills.
when this
our class last time, who was former president of Chile.
Chile. So when this film ends in the events of this film end in 93, the big push for about 20 years was gender integration. What I said was kind of a nightmare. What people kept finding in the UN is that because the UN structures that cared about women were underfunded and small and were just being moved into the big structures without any power, starting around 2004, there was a big campaign to create a separate UN entity focusing on women. That UN entity has come into being last year, and Michelle Bachelet is the head of that UN structure, and she is an undersecretary to the Secretary General. So the important thing in UN terms is she actually has the same power as almost all the big guys who are undersecretaries. Every other UN agency that was about women, the people, almost all women, who headed those agencies had very little power. So they upped her, they put a president in the position, and they gave it a budget that's more than less than UNICEF, but more than what UNIFEM used to get. So it's about 300 million. So in UN terms, UNICEF is like billions. And so this is medium big, with a president at the head, which counts for a lot in UN terms. Yeah?
How are those groups pushing for a separate international criminal court for women instead of more equality?
Well, because that
Would
goes...
be the question?
Why were those groups pushing for a separate international criminal court for women rather than integrating? At the time, there was almost no connection between the movement on the International Criminal Court generally and the women's groups. So they just called for their own structure. Once it became clear in the late 1990s that the International Criminal Court as a movement was gaining speed, those groups jumped over and basically said integrate gender. But functionally, they didn't talk to each other. So it's one of those weird historical moments.